Welcome to another episode of Electable. I'm Deb Chubb, and this podcast is sponsored by the Indiana Women's Action Movement. Today, we are embarking on a terrific conversation about political news in Indiana. We all know that political news has been hijacked a bit by both partisan and ideological extremes. And so I am very excited to learn about this new approach here in Indiana, and of course, and to learn more about Niki. So Niki Kelly is the editor-in-chief of the Indiana Capital Chronicle, a new online political news publication. And so, Niki, I'll turn over you if you can give me a little bit of background about you, because I know you have been a journalist here in Indiana for a while already, and about how you made this transition to this new publication.
Yeah, great. Thank you for having me. I'll start with just saying, I grew up in Ohio, but got my first job, my second job in journalism here in Indiana. And so moved and over here. And now I tell people I've lived in Indiana far longer than I ever lived in Ohio. So I'm officially a Hoosier in my mind. So I worked for the Fort Wayne Journal-Gazette for 26 years. Most of that here in Indianapolis, covering the legislature and the governor and state agencies and that kind of thing. So I have quite a lot of experience in state news and politics. And then, I was just kind of floating along like we do, right? We get comfortable in life, and this new opportunity came up, and I decided I loved the new framework of it. I loved doing a challenge. I'd been a reporter for so long that moving into editing and managing was attractive, but I also still get to keep involved in the State House, which is my love. So I jumped on this opportunity, and here we are. We basically, for people who don't understand, so the Capital Chronicle is part of what's called States Newsroom. It's a national nonprofit, and they've been slowly opening up bureaus in states. We're now at 28 states. And the idea behind it was that over the years, and I definitely saw this while at the State House, a number of newspapers have stopped covering the State House, or, they're only covering sort of the big scandal of the day and not sort of the ins and outs, the nitty gritty of all the other things. And so this is trying to fill a gap of news coverage for Hoosiers. And it's a nonprofit model, which is definitely new for Indiana, and it's starting to gain a lot of momentum around the nation as a new model, as we've seen newspapers especially struggle with advertising and expenses and slowly reduce staffing. I know when I was at the Journal-Gazette, my paper was very loyal and very supportive, and we always kept that bureau. And in fact, they are filling the bureau. But, I was still just one person. So every day I'd see 2 or 3 stories. I'd think, I'd really like to get to that story. And I just didn't have the time. So that is what we are trying to do in Indiana Capital Chronicle, is just cover a little more closely the governor, the legislature, the state agencies, overall issues that are important to the state. And it's in a free, non-paywall version. Of course, if you'd like to donate, you can. And there aren't any ads. And so we obviously are looking for support, but not, there's no subscription model. You can sign up for our newsletter and you'll get it in the morning and see our big stories of the day.
That's great. And so how many staff do you have?
Okay, so we have me, and then we have 3 reporters. 2 of the 3 have State House experience. Whitney Downard had covered it for about 5 years for CNHI, which is a company that owns a lot of smaller newspapers in Indiana. And so she provided them, coverage. And then Casey Smith, who worked for Associated Press, she covered the session for several years. And then we've got a wonderful young reporter coming up, Leslie Bonilla-Muniz, and she worked at the IBJ, the Indianapolis Business Journal, for about a year covering city issues. So those are our 3 reporters, and they all sort of have interests that they like, or that they're, kind of mini experts in, but we can all jump in on anything that we need to.
That's awesome. So, and so now you feel like you're with you and your three staff that you're really doing a lot more in-depth coverage of the state legislature and all of the stuff happening there at the Capitol.
Yeah, well, we launched June 25th, and I got to be honest, we were preparing for the launch, I was a little nervous. The summer isn't the busiest time for state news, but I also knew there's, like I said, news that's kind of under the surface that you got to dig for a little, and I knew that that was there. But then we got hit by a special session, so
Right.
the last 2 weeks have been extremely busy covering the special session, but super glad that we were able to show people right off like what we can do and what we can bring to the conversation.
That's awesome. And you do op-eds as well as just reporting, right?
Yep. Yeah, State's Newsroom in general likes, we do at least one commentary a day, and I've reached out to organizations, associations, people. We're trying to get a lot of diverse topics, and maybe people who you don't get to hear from all the time, who aren't the same people. And so we run one of those a day, and I do write one editorial a week, which is totally new for me because I'm not used to having an opinion that I can share. So yeah, and then we obviously, one of the other good things about State's Newsroom is we have a national bureau, a DC bureau. So we can also run stuff that they're writing every day to keep you a little bit up to date on, what's going out there in Congress. And they keep an eye out for, for our lawmakers getting involved out there too.
Well, that's great. And I want to mention, something about your organization is really that it's nonprofit and it really does embrace journalistic ethics, which is, important. Like I said earlier, there so many news organizations have just, thrown away the notion of journalism and the ethics that goes with journalism. I mean, being a journalist is very difficult. It's very, being objective and is very hard. Particularly on certain issues. But we've seen it just go, right over the cliff in terms of really manipulating the news in order to advance a particular political perspective. So I think that is one of the biggest and most important things about what you're doing is really that, here's an organization really trying to bring back some regular journalistic ethics into reporting and political news in particular. So,
all four of us are, obviously trained. We have degrees in journalism. We've been in this field for a long time. Also, we've got an ethics policy that's online for everyone to see if you ever have any questions about our ethics, and as well as if you need to look into sort of our donors. So we're transparent, just like we want our officials to be.
Oh, it is just so refreshing. Just so refreshing these days. So let's talk about some of the issues that you're working on and some of the things that are happening in the State House, and how you, when you mention transparency, of course, that's a big issue in our State House. And I wonder, how you're faring. How do you report the news when the supermajority, who will be deciding what the news laws are, hide in behind closed doors and refuse to comment, refuse to talk about what their plans are, what their motivation is, who they're trying to accommodate with laws. How do you manage that here in Indiana, where transparency is just not part of the legislative equation?
Yeah, I mean, I will say, leading up to the special session, that right, what you mentioned right there was a big concern. There were these Republican caucus meetings going on at hotels and things like that, and they were all sort of shut down and not speaking to anyone. Once session started, obviously that put it all out in the public, and so then we saw a lot of honest, good debate on the House and Senate floor about various amendments, about how to craft that bill. So I think once session got started, it became much more transparent. But no denying that in the beginning, it was just a bunch of Republicans behind closed doors trying to figure out, how they wanted this bill to craft. And in the end, they had trouble with that because the Republican super majorities in both the House and Senate are large enough that they have big wings on each side. And so they were struggling also to find something that all members of the party could accept.
Yeah, it is interesting, isn't it, that that Republicans dived right into this with such, disagreement amongst their own party members, and obviously in the end we saw that many Republicans voted against it because it was not harsh enough, and while others voted against it because they felt like it was too harsh. So that was really interesting, although they, still managed to, keep a majority of their people, within the group to pass these new strict, things. I just can't imagine. I mean, the implications of this new law are just endless. We're doing stuff here at our local level, doing some candidate forums, just on the local level. And someone said to me, well, at least we won't have to talk about abortion. And I said, oh no, we will be talking about abortion because this will be affecting your local county health department. It will be affecting everything. It will be affecting local hospitals. I mean, this is a huge public issue, public health issue that is going to affect everybody all down the line. From city government to county government and all the way around.
Yeah, and it's not over. I mean, obviously Indiana Right to Life and some of the more conservative members feel like the bill didn't go far enough. There are going to be fights about this in January. I know many bills are going to be filed. So I don't think this conversation is going to be over for quite a long time.
Right. Well, and it was interesting to see so little interest in any other financial accommodations. I mean, in the end, all you could think was that you people have not thought this through because you are clearly not thinking about the implications of this law. And, of course, we shouldn't be surprised considering that the legislature, the supermajority anyway, has ignored maternal mortality, infant mortality, women's health, women's, pay equity, women's, domestic violence against women, the epidemic of domestic violence. So that's already, been ignored for a long time. I mean, things like childcare, even though State Chamber of Commerce put it at the top of the list, the Farm Bureau put it at the top of the legislative agenda. We managed to get our own administration to complete a maternal mortality study and report with recommendations. None of that mattered. All those issues were still ignored by the legislature. So I guess I shouldn't be too surprised that that they continue to ignore it, even though they're going to exacerbate all of those problems and all of the disabilities and challenges that women are going to face. So I guess I shouldn't be too surprised.
I did want to clarify one thing. They did pass a wraparound supports bill. And so they did put aside about $78 million for various programs, including some additional adoption subsidies, child tax credits, child care tax credits. They eliminated the sales tax on diapers. They've changed some reimbursement for pregnancy services through Medicaid. Obviously, there's a lot to be said about whether they did enough, but they did at least do something.
They did do something, but yeah, forgive me for not being impressed with that little drop in the bucket. Yes. Considering they're willing to spend, $1 billion, $1 billion compared to 78 million, to just give everybody a $200 check, whether you need the money or not.
Very true.
I mean, yeah. So anyway, okay. So tell us, what are the stories that you see coming down the pike that you and your staff will be watching?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, right now we're taking a little breather. We still have news coming, but we've got some projects we'll have to lay out now that we weren't sure how long the special session would go and things like that. So, some of it is just daily stuff. Anything that pops up we'll be covering. We were working on a story today about a new report on Indiana child well-being and where Indiana ranks. We're working on a story about a lobbyist and attorney general Todd Rokita's office. So we've got lots of I guess pokers in the fire, so to speak. We love tips. If anyone has tips, please, please, please feel free to email. And but we're going to just really be focusing a lot on some larger issues, like, issues like affordable housing and environmental concerns and criminal justice reform and things like that. So we've only been around a month and a half, but we've got big plans, and I think we've gotten great feedback so far, and our reporters are kicking a little butt to start with. So I think people will be seeing what exactly we can do.
Excellent. And so how do you reach those, kind of marginalized communities to make sure that you are getting, their stories into your publication?
Yeah, that's always a struggle, obviously. And we really rely on a lot, community groups or organizations who, work with these people on a daily basis, so we can try to use them as conduits, so we can hear from real Hoosiers about things they need their state government to do, or to help them, or to not do sometimes, to back off, kind of thing. So I've been trying to reach out to a lot of groups and keep communication open. And that's always the struggle for journalists, is to try to get what we in journalism call real people, the people who are being impacted by a policy or a law, or, that kind of thing. And so that's definitely always.
Yeah, I think housing is really one of those topics that have been so difficult, because it doesn't seem like you can get down to the core of it. You can never find, are people really getting way evicted too much? And is it really for, this reason or that reason? Is it because of the pandemic? Is it because of, of landlords who don't want to, support low income families renting? Is it because of the housing market? Because the prices are going up so high, and so rent goes up. It's really that issue has been so difficult for me. And I've been out there. I ran for public office this spring in the primary, and when I was out there campaigning, a few people had mentioned it to me. Mostly they were people who were invested in real estate, and were not satisfied with what was being proposed. The federal aid, and we know that money came, but never. I'm sure much of it did get spent, but a lot did not even get spent. So, so clearly that was not the solution. That didn't work. And it was really difficult. It's really just a tough issue to get your head around and to really find the facts on. And I finally, I was making all these suggestions about what we could do. And this woman that I was chatting with didn't seem to like any of them. And so I was saying, well, what would you do? And it was interesting that, as someone who was involved in real estate investment for the purposes of renting, she said, well, the state should have a fund that so that renters can access it. It's like, well, I think we kind of do in sort of a way, but it's not working, So, and I've been involved on the other end too, working, talking with and working with renters who are living in places where there's black mold and the ceiling's falling in, but they can't say anything because they got nowhere else to go.
Right.
And they know for sure they'll get evicted. So yeah, that is a really difficult one, I think, for reporters to get onto and figure out. And of course, I'm very much looking forward to your look at the funding that's coming down. We all know there's billions of dollars coming into the state. There was, the CARES Act, ESSER 2, ESSER 3, ARPA, and then the bipartisan infrastructure bill. And then now there's the Inflation Reduction Act, which of course, a little bit of a misnomer, I guess, but lots of money coming in that too. And as I understand it, even a little bit for childcare. So I was very excited to hear that. So it sounds like it's kind of just a slimmed down, Build Back Better Act.
Yep.
So how do you plan to make sure people are informed about all of that funding? And because it's tricky, because a lot of it will be coming through the state government.
The state
probably will, right?
Yeah, the state is the pass through for the majority of it. Obviously, the good thing is they are required to post certain things about where it's going, their audit requirements and things like that. So we, I think the first couple rounds of the COVID stuff has shown us the process of how it would work. And we kind of understand how to deal with the Indiana Office of Management and Budget and those kinds of things. So at least we have a blueprint for how some of these other things are going to come through. It's mainly just on us to stay on top of it, right? And to not get distracted by smaller stuff, or, and not necessarily smaller stuff, but just
bigger stuff.
You just gotta maybe check on it once a month. Where are we at on this fund? Where are we at on that fund? A lot of this money has until 2024 to spend. So that's why some of it is still sitting there. They've easily spent half or more, but there are definitely still some places they could be putting that money. And I will say this coming in January, when the legislature meets, we're going to be drafting a budget. And that's where a lot of this conversation is going to go. When it was brought up during special session, that was the answer most of the time was, well, our budget's coming. We have, not only the regular budget, but we've got all the additional federal money. So I think a lot of decisions are going to be made in that session.
Is that really a thing that federal dollars, like by the bipartisan infrastructure bill, that money will really pass through the actual budget? It'll be included in the budget?
Yeah, it has recently. I know last budget, the legislature wanted to get involved with having a say on some of that instead of letting just the governor direct it all. And so they would move, they would say, okay, we need this $100 million over here for remediation grants for students who fell behind in school, and so they'll move it they'll separate kind of pots of money and where they want to put it. And then the administration is in charge of getting it out through grant programs.
Interesting. Oh, that is interesting. I wondered about that. So so we are going to be relying heavily on you to be, keeping track of that, because that was my thought too. All this money coming in, great, terrific. And much of it, will be organized labor because it's a federal dollars and has to comply with federal prevailing wage rules and all of that, which is also wonderful. But who's going to be keeping an eye on it? When there's that much money, it's just rife for, corruption and, handing off a few contracts to, your buddies. So we're going to really be relying on you to really watch all that. It's a lot. It's a lot.
It is. And we'll be tracking it. Like I said, I will say Indiana OMB has been pretty good about posting. They've got spots on their website to show where, like, here's where the CARES Act funding went, or here's where ESSER 1, ESSER 2. So I imagine they'll still be doing that on the other groupings. So.
Oh, well, that is good to know too. So, but yeah, this could be a full-time job.
Yeah. Really wait till I tell Whitney, who's handling most of our fiscal stuff. She'll be thrilled.
It's just so much money.
It is.
And if now this Inflation Reduction Act also produces more federal dollars that'll come into the state, oh my gosh. That's crazy. And then, so we've already seen some spending with, publicly anyway, with the READY grants, the $500 million that was, allocated, or I don't know if that's the correct word because the governor decided. Yeah. And so, already we've seen some issues with that. And I don't know if you've had any stories on that. I know, because there was 10 regions, each one got 50 million. And I'm up here in Northwest Indiana. And I already know, when that came out, there was an agency that listed Northwest Indiana Forum, for whatever reason, was the agent. And they listed all these projects. And I went in and looked at a bunch of them. And I thought, okay, yeah, go. So, and I think one important part of that is to know that no projects will be fully funded by that money.
Correct. It's an 80-20. Yeah, right. It's an 80-20 breakout. And so there's, 80% has to come from the feds, and then, well, it's federal money that's getting passed through. And then, the local entities as well as private developers have to definitely kick in.
Right. But already in ours, like, one of the first things that I found out was someone who sits on a local town council for a small town, who said, yeah, they had a project in there, but we haven't approved that project. That's not happening.
Well, yeah, I think there was some confusion in the beginning just because a group or that region, a lot of them put a bunch of projects on the list, but that didn't mean they were all funded. They were suggested projects. In fact, many of them, I know Northeast Indiana, they got the top 50 million, but they had probably $300 million worth of projects in there. So they were never going to all be funded. And so now we're in the process where they're winnowing down the ones. And also since then, the federal government has been a little more clear on the rules of how that money can be used. So some of those projects that they maybe hoped for maybe don't quite fit in with the federal rules that govern it now. So,
well, that's interesting because that's going to cause just all kinds of confusion, isn't it? You know, that they put out a list saying, okay, here's all the projects. And then it's like, well, no, they're not actually going to get money right away. They might get money. So, and because I know that in this particular little instance that I was aware of, you know, there was all kinds of uproar, like, wait, what? This project is happening? We haven't done it, you know. So anyway, hopefully that will be clarified as to what's happening and what's not happening. And of course,
each
again, we're relying on you to help us with it.
Yeah, each region handles picking those projects on their own, and those are public and have public meetings. So anyone locally, you know, can definitely be watching. And each region has their own sort of board that governs that. So I'm familiar with some of them, but not with the others. So I would keep an eye on those regions and see what people are applying for and what's getting approved.
So, and are they, you know, I mean, they're really, are there, what are the, I mean, are there rules for the transparency of spending any of this money? I mean, besides
I mean, it's all
the regular, like if you can dig into the government website and dig into, you know, the file cabinet, you know, and find it. I mean,
yeah, it's all public record, but you have to put in the effort. I mean, they're not going to.
Right.
But it's all public record.
Well, it sure would be. And I know it's expensive and I know it's difficult, but I've always been a big proponent of letting local, you know, communities decide more about it. And there have been other grants that do that. You know, the CDBG money, community development block grants, you know, they require that you have community engagement, that the community is involved in how the money is spent. Not that they all do it well, but there is an actual requirement of public engagement. So it would be nice if that were part of these grants. But we'll just have to see. I mean, everything's just so much money. And of course, as a result, you know, I think, you know, this whole idea of inflation coming out of nowhere, it's like, well, we did just shove a bunch of money into the system and, you know, fired up the economy, you know, which was what we wanted to do, I guess. But, you know, but there are ramifications. So, okay, so what other stories do you see coming down the pike?
Well, education is always a huge issue in Indiana, and our reporter Casey is our specialist on education. So, you know, we recently heard iLearn scores. This week, we're going to get some iRead scores. But, you know, she'll be looking at the overall issues of, you know, as we continue to not struggle, but look at sort of privatization and, you know, public education and private education that has grown more and more each year, each legislative session. So I'm sure that will continue to be a topic again this year. Obviously, another big thing on the education front is just our abysmal ratings on getting any sort of post-secondary education. And when people say that, they're like, well, not everyone needs a 4-year degree. And that's absolutely accurate. But these numbers also include people getting certificates or training. If you become a welder, if you know, any skilled sort of training you get goes into those numbers too. So we're not just talking 4-year college. We're talking, you know, you graduate from high school and you need some sort of training to figure out what you're going to do with your life.
Right. If you want to earn a living wage, you will have to have some kind of training and some kind of certification, no doubt. So, you know, I mean, aside from the impact on individuals, of course, that means statewide, we're less attractive to high-tech companies, high-tech manufacturers, and other things which we're already seeing. Those companies are going elsewhere. Where there is a much higher trained workforce.
Definitely.
So, yeah. So yes, you're right. That will be a struggle. Oh, man, there's so many things. Now, what about the elections? Are you going to be covering the
Oh,
elections?
yeah, we will definitely be jumping in on elections. Obviously, we have the entire Indiana House up for election. We have half the Senate up. We have several statewide races. I would say of the statewide races, the most interesting one is probably the Indiana Secretary of State. Democrat Destiny Wells is, doing pretty well for a red state. There was a recent poll put out that showed she was within the margin of error of leading Republican Diego Morales. And of course, Diego Morales defeated our incumbent Secretary of State in the GOP convention, which was a shock in and of itself. So definitely have some statewide races. On the congressional side, might have a few congressional races that are interesting, but most of them are probably pretty pro forma. US Senate, I think Todd Young probably doesn't face much likelihood of losing to Mr. McDermott. But we'll be covering all of those too.
Great. And now in Congressional District 2, Jackie Walorski sadly passed away. And I am having a hard time, even though I am in politics all the time, I am having a hard time trying to figure out, how does this work?
Well, it's funny you said that, because we are working on a story. It should be running Wednesday morning to talk about there are sort of two parallel tracks that happen with this. The first is you got to fill the remaining term. And that you do through a special election that the governor calls. There are no timelines for the special election or anything like that. We've had a couple instances in the last couple decades, and from what I'm told, it's virtually impossible to get a special election together in under 60 days. So at that point, what has happened in other years, and I expect might happen this year, is that they'll just coincide the special election with the November 8th general election, so that you don't have a second whole election and the expense and all of that.
And that's interesting though, because will Jackie Walorski's name still appear on the November 8th ballot?
Okay, so that's the second process.
Oh, okay.
So I said there are two parallel processes. Yeah. So then the second process is for the new term. And yes, so it will now be vacant. Obviously, there's a vacancy on the ballot. So a GOP caucus of precinct committeemen will choose whoever will be on the ballot now. Now, interestingly, that same process of a GOP caucus will choose the nominee for the special election. Likely they'll end up being the same person. It's slightly more complicated only because the current term falls under the current/old redistricting maps, and the November 8th election will fall under the new CD2 maps. So there are some slight differences on which precincts are in the committee and stuff.
That is so interesting. Wow, I am so impressed that you have figured this out. So kudos to your investigative skills, because and I was hearing all kinds of stuff from all kinds of people. Someone said, "Oh no, the special election is going to be after November 8th," but of course it makes sense to have it on November 8th. Why have a whole new expense of a whole special election? And oh man.
Yeah, I mean, we still have to hear from the governor, but that seems to make the most sense. Back in when Mark Souter in the third resigned back in those days, he resigned in like March of whatever year that was, 10 or 11, and they had that election the November on the same thing. So that was an even longer lead time. That was under Governor Daniels at the time. Similarly, when Julia Carson passed away, that was in December 2007, and they had that special election in March 2008 because there wasn't a regular election plan. So I assume we'll hear in the next couple of weeks, all of those caucuses have to meet. So there are timelines. They have to meet and pick nominees within 30 days, things like that. So we'll start seeing some local action on that.
Well, and we have to say too, I mean, sadly, another person who perished in that accident was the county chair. So,
yes.
So, person who would be putting this all together is, not there.
Yeah, it definitely obviously makes it even harder. Yeah, and just a terrible situation and all. Obviously, Congresswoman Mularski, and then her two staffers, and then another driver who was in the other car. So
Right, right. And so the seat will go vacant then. It will just be empty until whenever they do the caucus, I guess. The
correct.
caucus
Well, till the
election.
special election.
Oh, so then it will definitely be empty until November 8th.
Well,
that what you're
until
saying?
whenever the governor calls the special election, which I think will likely be
I see.
November 8th. That we don't know that for sure, but that has been, I mean, since it's already coming up, and if you
Yeah.
figure it would take at least 60 days to get it planned, that would be October,
Right,
another
right.
month. So,
Wow. Wow. And yeah, that I don't know how that is just so convoluted and complicated, but it is. It's shocking.
well, what's funny is if we had the same situation in the Senate, the governor appoints an interim, but in the House, we're not allowed to do that. You have to have a special election.
Yeah, that is very odd. Yeah, so many strange things. Okay, and so as to the Secretary of State election, I mean, the big issues, right, are voting access and vote and election security. I believe. I mean, I know there's other things the Secretary of State does. They run, does small business and all that stuff. But that seems to be the big issue. So what are you looking at to be the story there?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely say, I mean, any Secretary of State race always boils down to elections, even though the Secretary of State does a lot more than elections. But with Destiny Wells and Diego Morales being so, diametrically opposed, I mean, Diego basically has questioned the outcome of the veracity of the 2020 election. He's, pretty darn close to being an election denier, and Destiny haven't. Also, Diego wants to, limit some of the absentee voting and take away that, whereas Destiny would go the other route. So they are definitely showing a difference in, their positions. That's usually the case, but she's managed, I mean, she's very highly qualified, and he's got a little baggage along with him. He obviously was fired from the Secretary of State's office once. Second time he resigned before possibly being fired. So I think that is definitely making some headway in this race for her.
Wow. So any other political races that you think are going to be very newsworthy, something you're keeping your eye on?
Well, I mean, I think we all want to know what's going to happen with I know it's a couple of years away, but the governor's race is, kind of hanging out there. And so we're wondering if by the end of this year, we might start hearing some of the names on the Republican side, because, I could probably list 10 or 20 off right now of people who are allegedly interested. But, big decisions we need to hear from Senator Mike Braun. There's some concern about whether he just doesn't really love it in the Senate and might want to come back and run for governor. If that happens, who would run for U.S. Senate? We want to hear whether Lieutenant Governor Suzanne Crouch wants to run for governor. The last three. We've had 3 female lieutenant governors now, and none of them have run for governor right after that. So that's, been disappointing for people who wanted to see a woman on the ballot on the Republican side. We've seen it on the Democrat side, obviously. And so just waiting to hear from a lot of people on the Republican side, on the Republican side for governor. And, also on the Democrat side, I'm hearing a lot of people are talking about whether Joe Donnelly might come back and run. So he's currently the ambassador to the Vatican. And so he's, it's not this year, but that's definitely one that people are liking to talk about.
Yeah. All right. So no, you don't want to make any predictions?
Oh God, no, it's too early for predictions. I will say a lot of people are talking about Trey Hollingsworth a lot. He, announced he was not seeking re-election for Congress. He's been pretty quiet. I hear he's trying to build some sort of coalition down there. And so we'll see if maybe he becomes a factor too.
Yeah, that's interesting. He was always kind of, in my view anyway, just kind of absent. He's not from here. He's not from Indiana. He kind of came over here just before he ran. And, and as a congressman, I think was very quiet. I don't know of any legislation that
Hey,
was signed.
sometimes I'll take quiet over all the chatter
Yeah,
you see on Twitter, I'm not
that's true. It could be worse.
right.
Right. But
So,
that's interesting. And I wondered about that. That seemed, that was such an unusual way to leave Congress, was to say, oh, I believe in term limits, so I'm not running again. I was like, okay, that's a new one. Because I don't know if I've ever heard of it as someone doing that. Usually it's, oh, it's more time my friends, time with my family and friends, or whatever, personal or business or whatever. So that was an interesting one, but didn't make any kind of indication as to what he planned to do next.
right.
So yeah, that's an interesting one. I hadn't heard that one. I heard Mitch Daniels. I heard that one come up because he's resigning from Purdue. So that's interesting. I've heard on the Democratic side, Joe Hogsett, would be considering it. I mean, certainly he's right there in the thick of it. He's been in the thick of it. He's been banging heads with the state legislature. And so, he's certainly kind of prepared, I guess, probably more prepared than many other possible candidates at this point. So that'll be interesting. Okay, good. So those are good, well, not predictions, but ideas for 2024. All right. So outside of the elections, the other issue that we should talk about is environmental issues. I think. And so who's the reporter with the environmental specialty on your team?
I think both Casey and Leslie have both worked in that arena a little. So we'll just see as it comes up in session and stuff. I mean, unfortunately, you know how this goes. We don't see a lot of environmental legislation that moves in the legislature. I know we also need to keep an eye on the energy side of the topic. They're so intertwined, obviously. There's an energy task force tomorrow that I think we'll be attending. So yeah, I don't know exactly what to expect on that, but hopefully we'll be seeing some movement soon.
Well, and of course, because of the federal bill that just passed, and the environmental provisions of that bill. I know there's some financial stuff on the federal side, federal tax incentives for electric vehicles,
Yep.
And other renewable energy sources. So that'll be happening, and it will be interesting to see if Indiana is so dead set against saving the planet that they will be fighting any of that funding. I can't imagine that it's going to be a situation where funding will come in from the federal government to work on these issues, and the state will say no, thank you. I don't even know if it's possible. I know it's possible. It's been possible, and of course, been actually done in other areas. Healthcare in particular, where the state has just said no, thanks. We don't want the federal support. So
That doesn't happen very often.
no, I mean, you can't imagine. I can't imagine that would ever happen. And hopefully that's not going to happen here. I know it's brand new, just passed like yesterday, I guess.
Right.
Right. So we're still all trying to figure it all out. I was heartened to hear from my Congressman Mervan that there is actually some money in there for childcare. And so I'm interested in that. I mean, I've been a big proponent of advancing early childhood education and care infrastructure. Of course, as well, we're sitting on billions of dollars, and of course still cannot fully fund education, and it cannot support, public childcare, preschool, and despite, Illinois has been doing public full day pre-K for 40 years, but Indiana is that's just like the worst possible thing that anyone could even conjure. So it'll be interesting to see if some of that federal money can kind of just bypass this legislative, ignorance, as to the need for childcare. And, in some senses, I do get it that they ignore this issue because it is very complicated. Just like the abortion issue, you can see the legislature, they had to do that. I think basically because they all signed those pledges when they took all that money. from very conservative anti-choice groups. They had to sign the pledge. If they wanted the money, they had to sign the pledge. They signed the pledge. Now they had to, fulfill their duty, I guess. And incidentally delved into an area that nobody had, just recognized the complexities and the implications of, and ended up, in my mind, bringing on disaster. Childcare, likewise, is extremely complicated. I worked in early childhood education for many years, and I understand the complexity of those issues and how it affects families and children, and and public education as well. So I can see in a sense why they have not delved into it, because it's complicated, and of course they are managed by these very conservative lobbyists who want to continue to take state money and provide subpar childcare in religious facilities where there's very little oversight, and no real adherence to curriculum or education. So I think I think that's part of it too. That's why they have not delved into this issue. It'll be interesting to see if that federal money either bypasses the state or it somehow forces Indiana to do something.
Yeah, we'll see. We probably won't get guidance on that for a couple months.
Yeah, you're right. So anyway, hopefully people will be happy. I mean, as to the environmental issues, I think this was politically so important for, the Biden administration. This was really an area where particularly young people were dissatisfied and disappointed in the federal government's ability to do something about climate change. And so let's hope that this bill does something and will bring young people back into that. I think that is a big area of interest that I wonder if you're thinking of, writing about or looking into, and that which is, young people's kind of, I don't know what to call it, disengagement, disillusionment, with politics in general. When I talk to young people about politics, often they'll say, doesn't matter, they're all corrupt. Democrats are no better than the Republicans. It's all for nothing. So I don't know, is that a story that you're interested in looking at?
I mean, possibly. They're all up there. I mean, that's a hard nut to crack. I mean, and I don't, young people, but I think it's pretty much everyone, not just young people. There's just a lot of disillusionment out there. I try to tell my daughter and my friends that, I know a lot of politicians on a more personal level, and that the majority of them are honestly there to do what they feel is right for the state, and they're not taking bribes or doing anything crazy. But there's always one or two bad ones that taint everyone else. So
right. So, and I wonder if you're familiar with oh gosh, now the name of it is escaping me, Bill Moreau's organization.
The Citizen.
Yeah, it is. Oh gosh, I can't
Indiana
remember.
Citizen, I think.
Is that it? Indiana Citizen? I thought there was another word too, but maybe not. Anyway,
Maybe not.
So I wonder if you're familiar. And I don't know a whole lot about this, but I've heard that they are working on a study of young people's engagement.
Oh, well, that would be fascinating to see.
Yes, I am very excited about that too. So I guess I need to call.
I will say the last 2 weeks, I saw a lot of young people engaged in the State House. The only sad thing is they walked away very disappointed.
Right. They were upset. I know I was down there for those protests, and there were a lot of young women in particular. And it was just, it was horrifying. And many of those young women standing there with their protest signs, just crying. And I, just tried to give out hugs and, and give out my card and say, hey, I can help you do something. You need to run for office is mostly what I was telling them. But you're right. And I hope that doesn't have, a worsening impact on disengagement with politics. Let's hope it's the opposite.
Yeah. We'll see in November.
We will. We'll see in November. I certainly have seen lots more activism, in the last couple of weeks as well.
Yeah.
So, okay, so we are running out of time. And but I want you to tell us how, if you got a tip, who do we call?
Oh,
How do we get you?
absolutely. So first of all, it's indianacapitalchronicle.com. It is capital with an A. And we're on Facebook, we're on Twitter. You can send me direct messages with tips. When you sign up for our newsletter, which you can do so at indianacapitalchronicle.com, you can also email in at info@indianacapitalchronicle.com with tips. And I check that email multiple times a day. So yeah, so I appreciate any tips and any subscribers, and spread the news.
Great. And now, are you going to have like a, letters to the editor kind of thing, or?
No, we have the commentary, but we don't really have letters to the editor. I think with a 4-person staff, it would just kind of get out of control. I'm not sure I have enough time to do those. And then so, but we do accept commentary submissions. So, and there's guidelines on our website.
Excellent, excellent. All right, well, that's great. And I wish you all the best. This is such an exciting project, and it's just wonderful and very, as I said, refreshing to see this approach to journalism and politics in Indiana.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Oh, yeah. Okay, great. And so hopefully we can come back and reconnect, and we can get updates maybe, closer to the election or after the election, just to really get some updates on what's happening and what your organization is doing and what stories you're looking at.
Absolutely.
All right.